I need to ask everybody a question, and that question is the following. What is the most memorable room that you've ever been in? The most memorable room that you've ever been in. And while you start to think about the answer to yours, let me tell you a little bit about mine. You see, the most memorable room that I've ever been in was about half the size of the one that we're in here today. But like this room, there were no windows. So all the light that penetrated into the room I'm describing came from a ceiling that was so high that if 5 of me were on top of one another, we still wouldn't get close to touching the ceiling. Such was the height of the room. The floor of the room was made of like a rubbery material. The room was completely empty, except for 8 white plastic chairs, 4 on each side of the room that were facing in on one another. The room didn't really have a smell, but it did have an energy. Sometimes that energy came into the room in the form of silent anticipation, similar to how before an exam back in high school, nothing would be said, but there was an energy in that exam room despite the silence. Sometimes that was the energy that was in this room. And then there were other times where that energy of silence was displaced by such thunderous noise that those 8 white plastic chairs would vibrate up and down on that rubbery floor. Now, the room that I'm describing is one that not just anyone could enter. You had to be invited into this room. And on the evening that I was invited into this room, I became the first Australian to step foot in a room like this since Cathy Freeman, before she walked out and sprinted to Olympic gold at the Sydney 2000 Games in the 400 metres. Now, the room that I'm describing is the one that I waited in moments before taking my lane of the final of the 400 metres at the London 2012 Olympics. And what makes this room so memorable for me is 2 things. The first is that I have never been more nervous in a room in my life. My right leg was physically shaking to the point that I had to slap it a number of times just so I could put my shoes on to then go out and walk onto the athletics track. So that's the first reason it was memorable. Never before have I literally been shaking in a room with nerves. And then the second reason is because what it meant to me to be invited into that room, to be in the room with the 7 other fastest humans on the face of the planet over 1 lap of the track. The journey of my athletic career that earned me the invite is what made that room memorable. Now, we're all in this room together today. And it's my mission over the next 30 minutes to make this experience too a memorable one. Because over the next 30 minutes, we're going to be deconstructing the myth of high performance. And we're going to do it in quite a fun way. Because I only like to speak about things that I know and that I've experienced. And there's nothing that I know better or have experienced more than running the 400 metres. So what I'm going to invite everyone to do today, don't get too nervous, we're not running a 400 metres. But what I'd like us to do today is run a virtual lap of the track together, from the start to the finish line. And I'm going to break out the 400 metres into 100-metre segments, just as I do in my training. And as we transition through each 100-metre segment, I want to pass on a lesson that I've learned through over a decade in professional sports. So that's our plan today. But before we get into that, let me introduce myself a little bit more, because I really want to become more of a friend to all of you. So my name's Steve Solomon, I'm 29 years old, and I've been representing Australia for the last 12 years in athletics. I was a co-captain of the Australian athletics team at the most recent Olympic Games in Tokyo, and I'm currently preparing for the next and possibly my last Olympics that will take place next August in Paris. Now, I also need to admit something quite confronting and embarrassing to you. And the truth is, I did not grow up wanting to be an Olympian. I actually grew up wanting to be James Bond. I'm not kidding. And when I finished high school, the British Secret Intelligence Agency, they weren't interested in letting in this Australian. So instead of going to Britain, I instead went to America, and I spent 6 amazing years in America, 4 of those studying an undergraduate degree at the University of Stanford, and then 2 years following that at the University of Duke, doing a Masters in Management. Now, I went into university thinking that I would leave as a doctor. That's what I thought that I would leave as. But instead, I got immersed in the world of technology and entrepreneurship. And I came back to Australia and I spent 4.5 years working at Uber on the Uber Eats side of the business, and now have just made the transition to joining TDM, working on the investment team, helping TDM make investments in great generational businesses like GYG. The last two things that you need to know about me is that 2023 has been a fabulous start to the year, as just in January I got engaged to the love of my life, Gabby, while away in South Africa. Thank you. Thank you. And the last thing that I need you to know is that if you can't find me at the athletics track or in the TDM office, which is where you'll find me most of the time, if you can't find me in one of those two places, you will find me around the Bondi area walking my 2.5-year-old golden retriever. I'm a massive dog person, and I hope there's a couple more of those like me in the room today. So with that, let's get started in thinking about how we're going to navigate this lap of the track. I'm going to talk to you about what it's like walking to the start line. I'm going to bring you back to an experience of what is it like walking to the start line of an Olympic race. And in that, I want to bring you towards my start line, which is how did I get started in the sport of track and field? If I grew up wanting to be James Bond and I ended up wearing a speed suit instead of a real suit, how did that come about? And the key message I want you to take away from when we get to this part of the talk is that by doing lots of different things, we give ourselves the opportunity to figure out what it is that we enjoy and what it is that we're good at. And when we marry those two things, that's how we know that we're getting on the right start line. Once we get to the start line, to the starting blocks, we're going to power around that first curve. And it's at this point that I'm going to talk about the importance of setting really high goals and having a team around you to inspire and motivate you towards those goals. Because if you're going to find yourself on the start line and you're not aiming super, super high, then I would argue that we shouldn't be at the start line. We haven't found our race. So that's what we're going to do when we focus on the first part of the 100 meters or the 400. We're then going to power around that first curve. We're going to whip off onto the back straight. At this point, we're moving 10 meters a second. In the 400 meters, when we're going down that back straight, running 10 meters a second. I would step that out for you, but we don't have 10 meters on the stage. When we're moving that fast, things can go wrong. Chaos can ensue. So it's actually at this point in the race that we need to remain disciplined, to remain really focused. So when we get to this part of the 400 meters, I'm going to talk about the discipline and self-awareness that you need in high performance to get past this chaos in the race so that you hit the 200 meter mark, the halfway point, in a good position. Because in the 400 meter race, we say that the race can't be won in the first 200 meters, but it can be lost. If you are undisciplined down the back straight, you will lose the race. So we're not going to make that mistake today. We want to talk about the discipline needed to run that back straight well. We're then going to get to the top curve. At this point in the race, we would have been running for about 21 seconds. We've burned through 2 of the body's 3 energy systems. This is the part that it starts to get hard. And when we get to the topic of hard things, we're going to talk about, and I'm going to be open about, the hardest part of my athletic journey to date, which is failing in the world of high performance. I'm going to talk to you about what it was like to fail in my pursuit for the 2016 Games and what I learned from that. Because when we win, we celebrate, and when we lose, we have the opportunity to learn. So we'll learn together as we get around that top curve. And then finally, we're going to come into the home straight. At this point in the race, we've been sprinting for about 30 seconds. In that 30 seconds of time, our blood inside the body has actually turned acidic. The lactic acid has caused hydrogen ions to flood through our systems. Our muscles are going to struggle to contract. Our shoulders are going to want to become earrings. We're going to start wanting to lean back. And this is the point of the race where you've actually got to dig into yourself and do everything that your body's telling you not to do. Your body's trying to get into the fight or flight response. And the thing about being successful down the final 100 meters, the thing that we're all going to power down the final 100 meters together doing, is staying relaxed. And there's a secret to staying relaxed, and that is going to remain a secret until we get to that part of the race. But I'm really excited to be able to leave on the note of how do you summit high performance? How do you make sure that when you look at the clock at the finish line that you've won the race? That's what we're going to focus on as we get down the final straightaway. So with that, I want to take you back to Tokyo. It's now 2 years ago. The Tokyo Olympics were unlike any other Olympics before it, and hopefully unlike any other Olympics to come. It was one of those Olympics where we had to be watching it on TV. In fact, our visas as athletes were tied to our competition days, which meant that unlike the London Olympic Games where I was partaking in the opening ceremony on the track, I was just 2 years ago watching the opening ceremony on my couch in Sydney, knowing that 10 days later I would be flying over and competing on that track. It was a very bizarre games. Of course, there were no crowds. But the truth is, you don't need a crowd when you're at the Olympic Games to feel the nerves, to feel the pressure. When we walked to the start line, in front of me was Wade van Niekerk, the world record holder in the 400 metres, fastest man in history to ever run one lap of the track. In front of him was a national record holder of Italy over 400 metres, fastest Italian to ever run one lap of the track. In front of him was a Japanese national record holder, and you start to get the picture. This is the environment, this is the top of the top, this is the high performance environment. And how did I find myself there? I grew up wanting to be James Bond, I didn't grow up wanting to be an Olympian. But I did growing up loving sport. I played soccer, I played cricket, I played tennis, I did anything that I could get my hands on. And when I started high school, at Cranbrook High School in Sydney, on the very first day, one of the teachers came up and asked, would I be interested in joining the athletics team? And what do you think, now knowing a little bit about me, loving sport, energetic, said in reply, I said, great, tell me when it is. So I showed up that next morning, and I showed up at the 100-metre training. And then I actually showed up at the hurdles training. And then I showed up at the long jump training. And then I showed up at the high jump training. And then I showed up at the javelin training. They told me not to come back to the javelin when they realised I could throw a ping pong ball further than I could throw the javelin. But that's besides the point. 4 years after starting in that first training session, I ran my first 400-metre race. 4 years after starting. And it was in that 400 metres that the race really spoke to me. It combined the things that I was good at and that I enjoyed. It combined all the different elements of the sports that I'd have enjoyed playing, and it combined the elements of what I've enjoyed through my time exploring all the different events in track and field until I found the one that was right for me. And I think that's a really important lesson, and it's one that I get really excited to speak with you all today, because we've got a really young, enthusiastic and talented audience. One where I'm not sure if you found your 400 metres yet. But I do know that you're in an incredible environment to explore and figure out what it is that you enjoy and what it is that you're good at. And I have full confidence that when you marry those two things together, you are going to find yourself on the start line of your 400-metre race. Which is where I want to take us now. Again, let's bring you back to Tokyo, because the start line in Tokyo was unlike any other start line I've ever competed in. And the reason for that was it was so hot in Tokyo. I don't know if anyone's been to Tokyo in the summer, but it was so hot in Tokyo that while we were walking out onto the athletics track to set out our blocks, a volunteer came with a bottle of water and poured it on the line so that we didn't burn our fingertips off while we waited for the gun to go. Never in my 12 years of racing have I ever competed in such heat. But the thing to know while we're at the start line is, how do we maximise ourselves around that first curve? As the gun's about to go off, how do we make sure that we are powering out, putting 500 kilos of force into the ground with each step, positioned correctly, so we start ourselves up for success in the race? And that's what we're going to talk about now, because we're at the start line, the 400 metres. The best way to start the race, and the only way to start the race, is to set really, really high goals and have people around you to feed you into those goals. And this is where it becomes particularly exciting to be speaking to GYG, and it will become clear in a moment. But when I started athletics, so when I started training outside of my school carnivals, I was 16 years old. And the training squad that I joined was run by a 68-year-old Ukrainian lady by the name of Fira Divoskina. And for the first 9 months, I didn't understand anything Fira was saying. She spoke a hybrid of Russian and English. But the thing about high performance is you actually don't need to hear it. So much about high performance is observing, is seeing how people go about their business. That, to me, is what high performance was. It is about what high performance is, and it's how I got introduced to it. My teammates were aspiring to be national champions. They were aspiring to be the best in Australia. My teammates were aspiring to represent Australia at the biggest championships, World Championships, Commonwealth Games. I'm a 16-year-old kid. I was a soccer player at this stage. I was not an athlete. But I immediately adopted the goals of the people that I was surrounded by. So I wanted to become the fastest 400-metre runner in Australia. I wanted to become an Olympian. And it was only by product of my proximity to these people did I take their goals and make them my own. And why I say that with such enthusiasm and energy to GYG is that you have a leadership team in this business that aspires to be the best QSR brand in the world. You have a team that is inspiring the highest level of goal that you can create and has identified in every single one of you the talent to run that goal on the front line in the restaurant. That is such an energizing position. It is the exact position that I was in. I was a young kid with a bit of talent, just as a lot of you in this room are young with a lot of potential. And you've got a leadership around you in this business who has put on the pedestal the highest goal possible to be the best QSR restaurant in the world. And what an amazing thing that is from someone who's been in that position and seen how it can help propel you through that journey. Because getting to the best in the world is really, really hard. And you're going to have to rely on that goal a lot, especially when the going gets tough. Let me give you an example of how I rely on my goal of wanting to be the best in the world every single week. And I've chosen this example because it's away from running. Every week I do a cross-training workout on the exercise bike. It's 20 repetitions of 1 minute hard, 1 minute easy. And this is a kind of workout where I know we've all experienced it before, where after the 6th repetition, I want to get off the bike. It's hard. I'm hyperventilating. My legs are tired. My brain starts getting me all of these messages to get off the bike. Steve, you had a great training session yesterday. Don't overdo it today. Steve, you could injure yourself if you continue at this velocity. Seriously, Steve, step off the bike. These messages come into our brains when we try and do something that's really difficult. I'm seeing some nods in the room because I know that these messages have come into your brains as they have come and will continue to come into the brains of anyone who goes on to achieve something great. And the reason for that is this. I did a human biology degree at Stanford University. I paid special attention to the brain. The brain has been designed to survive. It's been designed to keep us alive. It hasn't been designed to let us live. So what happens when we go about these activities that threaten survival? The brain doesn't care if GYG is the best restaurant brand in the world. What the brain cares about is making sure that you're living and breathing the next day. So we've been designed to survive. We haven't been designed to live. So unless we have a goal that's really, really high and really, really hard, we're going to give in to that voice inside the head that tells us to stop, that tells us to put our foot off the pedal. And that's where we've got to keep going. And the way that we keep going is not just to have a really high goal, but to have a group of people around us to go towards that goal with together. And that's where it becomes particularly exciting to be speaking with this cohort, you, today, because you are the leaders in restaurant. You have the ability to instill on the 16-year-olds like I was when I was joining my athletic squad, the disciplines and habits of high performance. You're able to show them what is possible. That is unique within you. And this is an evolution that's going to be able to continue over time. That's a unique position to you. Pressure is a privilege. I do not have 1 second of doubt that what you do is very difficult. I know what you do is very difficult. But pressure is a privilege, leadership is a privilege. You have the position, and aren't you grateful for the position of being able to influence the next generation of leaders that come through the business and beyond, to help them find their race, whether it's in the restaurant or outside of the restaurant. You have the ability to do that, and that's a really unique thing. And you also have the position to do it in a team, in an organization that's trying to be the best. It's very rare, very unique. And that is what's going to propel us around that first 100 meters of this race, is setting really high goals and doing it and pursuing it with a group of really passionate people that when that brain starts talking that it's enough, it's too hard, we need to stop, that you're able to keep going. Because being great once is easy. Winning once is easy. But the true test of a legend, the greatest of all time, what we're aspiring to, that's the ability to withstand time. And that's what you're doing. That's what you're building in your restaurant. It's very special. So that's the first 100 meters of the race. We're now going to whip onto the back straight. Like I said, we're moving at 10 meters a second at this point. The back straight is all about discipline. It's all about remaining composed under pressure. The 400 meters is a staggered start, which means that we don't start in the line, we start separated. And depending on how different runners run their different race patterns, chaos can ensue down the back straight. You can be running in your lane and then somebody on your inside can come up on you. And your brain can panic. If they're up on you already, it means that they're probably 6 or 7 meters ahead of you at that point in the race. What do? The inexperienced athlete panics. He accelerates. The experienced athlete knows that the only place in the race that counts is the finish line. So he remains composed. So that's what we're going to talk about now while we're running down this back straight, is how do you remain disciplined and composed? And that all starts on the training ground. My training week looks like the following. I've got 3 hard running workouts, 3 hard cross-training workouts, 3 strength sessions, 1 Pilates session, 1 physio session. And I say that these are my training sessions because there's a distinction that I make between training and exercising. Training is when you go into an activity when you know that it's part of a plan. It's one step in a puzzle. You go into that training session with a specific goal. What am I trying to get out of this? And how does getting that allow me to get to where I want to go? That's training. That's different from exercising. Exercising is where you just go about the routine. You're not conscious of what you're doing outside of the fact of how it relates to what you're going to build on or do in the future. That's exercising. I train 10 times a week. I don't exercise. There's a difference there. It's a subtle difference, but I know GYG understands the difference. Training is about doing the same thing that you've done hundreds of thousands of times over again to develop self-awareness. So that when you look at me and see me running, I look at myself and I see, what is my arm angle past the hip? How is my head position above my torso? Am I dorsiflex or plantarflex to my foot? Am I losing energy through the ground or am I gaining energy through the ground? That mastery comes by self-awareness, and that self-awareness comes from having the discipline of being able to do the same thing over and over again until you become a master at it. Now, there's a lot of self-awareness in this room. There's been a lot of learnings that have been cultivated from the first restaurant opening in Newtown 17 years ago. I know that there are people in this room that can look at a piece of chicken and decide if it's perfectly cooked. I know that there's people in this room that know, without even tasting it, what a chip's going to taste like if it goes into the fryer frozen versus if it goes into the fryer sweaty. I know that there are people in this room with the self-awareness to know how a customer experience starts before the burrito even hits the tongue. That's what you're cultivating down the back straight. That's what you're doing every single day on the training ground, so that when it comes to the race, when all the chaos is ensured and there's thousands of people lining up at the restaurant and that bloody Uber Eats tablet's pinging every 3 seconds, that you're able to stay composed and relaxed and deliver the products that are going to make you the greatest QSR brand in the world. That's what discipline down this back straight looks like. So now we're halfway through the race. 21 seconds of sprinting. We're now going to tilt our torso slightly forward. Because we run around to the left, we're going to cut our left arm angle just a little bit, extend the right one, so we're going to push around the bend. And now we're going to run the 200 to 300 meter segment. This is where the race starts to get hard. And now I've got to be really vulnerable, and I've got to tell you about the hardest time in my athletic career. And before I get to there, I've got to set the scene. 2012, I finished 8th in the world as a 19-year-old at the Olympic Games. I left that night wanting to win a medal at the next Olympics. And a year and a half before those Olympics, the next Olympics being Rio 2016, I found myself, it was about midnight, in my dorm room at Stanford University, and I was looking at myself and I was thinking, am I in the best position for success at next year's Olympics? The fact that I was still studying at midnight helped me to make the decision that, no, that wasn't in the best interest to give me the best chance of succeeding at those games. So I made a difficult decision, but one 100% aligned to that goal of trying to medal in the Rio Olympics. I made the decision to move away from Stanford University. I asked myself the question, where is the best place for me to train? If I've identified that where I am is not, where is the best place for me to train? And I landed on the Australian Institute of Sport. They had the best coaches, the best biomechanists. So I moved my life from America to Canberra, and I literally lived like a monk for 18 months. I woke up, I trained, I ate, I trained, I slept, I trained. And training was really hard, as you can imagine. There were multiple times a week where after the last rep of a workout, I would be lying on the floor. My coach would have a watering can of cold water literally pouring on me, while I had a training partner holding my legs, draining the lactic acid, while I had a physiologist pricking my ear to get my blood lactate. And in the back of my head, I knew that some point between finishing that rep and 7 minutes after, which is when your blood lactate level peaks, I'd be puking on the ground. That was the intensity of training that I was putting in every single day down in the AAS. And then the year of the Olympics came, 2016. And I need everyone to take their hands in front of their face for me at the moment. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to clap. And when you clap, I want you to see if you can differentiate the amount of time that it takes for the sound to travel from your colliding palms to your ears. Because obviously there's a speed of sound, right? I want you to see if you can pick that up with a little delay between the clap and the ears. Do that a few times for me now. Can anyone do it? Can anyone see that amount of time? It's an impossible amount of time. I missed out on qualifying for the Rio Olympic Games by 4/100ths of a second. You take 1 second in my world and you divide it 100 times. And in 4 of those slices was the difference between me making the games and me failing the games. And the reality of high performance is that the line is that thin and you never know where that line is. In my world, you get to race and you get to see it and you get to feel it. And in some ways that's good, in some ways that's bad. But in any case, when you fail in the way that I failed, when every single one of the people in your life knows that you're training for something that you don't qualify for, when you have your name in the back page of the paper with the title Solomon Fails, that's a hard reality of trying to strive for something really great. And it's when you find yourself in these moments that you have to look into yourself and you have to think, what went wrong? Because when we win, we celebrate. I couldn't tell you how I got to the Olympic final in London, but I can tell you how I failed in the Rio Olympics. And it realized that the question to which I asked myself was the wrong question to ask. I asked myself the question, where is the best place for me to train? Which was the wrong question. The question that I've been asking myself every year since failing to make those games, and has led me to make the 2017 World Championships, 2018 Commonwealth Games, 2019 World Championships, 2020 was COVID, 2021 Olympics, 2022 World Championships, Commonwealth Games is this. Where am I at my best? Now that's a subtle difference to the uneducated. The best place for me to train, where am I at my best? But let me spell it out so it's really clear. When I was isolating my performance to where is the best place for me to train, the only thing that I was looking at my performance through the lens of was coaches and facilities. Now we all know that when you are at your best, your life is more than just your coaches or your facilities in your respective realms. It's feeling confident, it's feeling happy, it's feeling supported, it's feeling inspired. So every single year since failing to make those games, I've asked myself the question, where am I at my best? And I've built my environment around that. And I challenge you to do the same. I wish that you could just hear these words and learn this lesson, but like almost any lesson, they have to be felt. And there are going to be times through your career, as there has been times through everyone's career who has gone to achieve great things, that you are going to have to take this exhaustive failure and turn it back into fuel. Because that's the only way that you're going to get around that top curve, and it's the only way that you're going to give yourself the chance to storm down the home straight and win the race, which is what we're about to do right now. So that's navigating the top curve. High performance is hard. Getting to the top is hard, but you have been identified as having what it takes to navigate the trenches of failure, to look into that pain, to draw the lessons out, to have the self-awareness to make the corrections, to allow yourself the shot at the finish line. Now, as we power into the home straight, I told you that I had a secret that I was holding from the start. Now it's time for me to share. And this isn't something that I came up with. I need to bring in someone by the name of Dan Chambliss. You don't need to know Dan's name, you don't need to remember all that much about him except for what he uncovered about high performance and how do you get to the top of the world. So Dan was a swimming enthusiast. He was a Yale PhD in America, but he loved swimming. So he went out and sought to study what separates a school-level swimmer from a state-level swimmer, and what separates a state level from a national, and what separates a national from an Olympian. That's what Dan went out to study, which basically can be said, Dan went out to study of how do you get from novice to the top of the world. So Dan started with what naturally comes easy. Was it the amount of time that they spent in the pool? Did a state level swimmer spend more time in the pool than a school level? Did a national spend more time in the pool than a state? Did an Olympian spend more time in the pool than a national? Went, crunched all the numbers, no correlation. The amount of time that you spent in the swimming pool did not correlate with your ability to progress. So Dan says, okay, if it's not the amount of time we spend in the pool, is it your swimming technique? Is it that to get from a school level to a state level, you've got to improve your technique? Is it that national level had better technique than state level, and then Olympians have better technique than national? Went, crunched all the numbers, no correlation. So now Dan has to get creative. If it's not the amount of time that you spend in the pool and it's not your ability to swim in the pool, what is it? So he gets creative. He said, is it your ability to recover? So Dan went and crunched all the numbers. Was it the amount of hours that each athlete spent sleeping each night? And he crunched all the numbers and he found no correlation. This is what Dan found. Dan found that to navigate from a school level to a state to a national to Olympian, you did not need to be an outlier in any one skill, but instead had to be just a little bit better than average at the 5 key components that made up that task. And let me give you a real life example of that. As a 400 meter runner, I am not the fastest by raw speed. I am not the strongest by raw strength. I am not the fittest by raw fitness. I am not the toughest in terms of pain tolerance. And my stride length is not the longest of any of my competitors. But on average, I'm a little bit faster, I'm a little bit stronger, I'm a little bit fitter, I'm a little bit tougher, and I have a little bit longer of a stride that when you compound all of those averages gets me to the top of the world. And why I like ending the race on this part is that there is no single person in the room who can tell me that they are not capable of being just a little bit better than average at something. And my challenge to you as we cross this finish line together is to think about what are the 5 key operators, the 5 key metrics that makes a great GYG operator. And can you as a collective in the room today commit to being a little bit better than average at each of those, knowing that all of those averages are going to compound on one top of one another to bring you to the greatest QSR brand in the world. Thank you.